The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the quiet streets of a suburban neighborhood in Fairview Heights, Missouri. Dana Collins, a polished and composed woman in her early 40s, was driving home from a work meeting. Her car, a sleek black Tesla, glided effortlessly down the road. It was one of those moments where she felt grateful for how far she'd come. But her tranquil drive took a sharp turn as red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. The unmistakable sound of a siren pierced through her thoughts. Dana's heart rate spiked, not from fear but from frustration. She had done nothing wrong. Checking her speedometer, she confirmed she was well below the limit. Still, she signaled, pulled over to the side, and took a deep breath. The patrol car rolled to a stop behind her. Officer Mark Benson stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder as he approached her vehicle. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with an air of authority. His gaze was hard, his lips set in a thin line. Dana pressed the button to roll down her window, her expression calm but alert. Before she could say anything, the officer leaned down, peering into the car with an intensity that made her grip the steering wheel just a little tighter. "License and registration," he said curtly, his tone clipped and devoid of courtesy. Dana retrieved her documents, her movements measured. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Her voice was steady and professional. He narrowed his eyes. "I'll be asking the questions here. Step out of the vehicle." There was no explanation, no context. Dana hesitated, not out of defiance, but because she knew the law. There was no reason for her to step out, and he hadn't provided one. Her pause seemed to irritate him further. "I said step out of the vehicle," he barked, his voice rising enough to turn a few heads from passers-by. Dana locked eyes with him. She wasn't about to give in so easily, but she knew this was just the beginning. Her silence left the air heavy, making it clear this encounter was far from over. Dana's composed demeanor seemed to irritate Officer Benson even more. His hand rested on the holster of his gun, not drawing it, but enough to send a clear message. The subtle gesture wasn't lost on Dana, but she refused to let it shake her. Instead, she maintained her calm, unflinching gaze. "Officer, I'm happy to comply if you can provide a valid reason for asking me to step out," she said firmly, her voice steady. His jaw tightened as he leaned closer to the window. "You're acting suspicious. This is my call, and I don't have to explain myself to you." The dismissiveness in his tone was as loud as the authority he was trying to project. Dana exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to escalate the situation. Instead, she unlocked her car door and stepped out, standing tall despite the officer's intimidating stance. She wore a navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, her appearance immaculate. If Benson noticed, he didn't seem to care. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered, stepping back slightly as if expecting her to make a sudden move. Dana complied, raising her hands slightly, though the gesture felt both unnecessary and humiliating. A small crowd had started to gather at a distance, their murmurs growing louder. "You're driving an expensive car in an area where we don't see too many visitors," he added, letting the implication hang in the air. Dana's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Are you saying I don't belong here?" Benson smirked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm saying it's my job to make sure everything checks out. Where are you headed?" "Ma'am." "Home," she replied simply. "I live here." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Is that so? Care to prove it?" Dana opened her mouth to respond, but a woman from the crowd shouted, "Leave her alone. She hasn't done anything." Benson turned sharply, glaring at the onlookers. "Mind your own business," he snapped, his frustration beginning to show. Dana seized the moment. "Officer, I'd like to remind you that I'm fully cooperating, but your behavior is inappropriate and unprofessional. If you have nothing further, I'd like to go." His face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and anger. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near growl. "You don't tell me how to do my job." But Dana wasn't backing down. The tension in the air was electric, and everyone watching could sense that this encounter was heading toward an inevitable breaking point. Dana didn't flinch under Benson's simmering glare. She had dealt with men like him before, Men who thought authority gave them the right to belittle and intimidate. But she also knew the power of remaining composed. Every word, every gesture, every moment of silence was a choice. And right now, Dana chose to let Benson dig his own hole. "Officer," she began, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I'm well aware of my rights. Unless you have probable cause or evidence that I've committed an offense, you have no grounds to detain me." Her words were measured, deliberate. The gathered crowd murmured in approval, emboldened by her confidence. Benson, however, looked like a kettle about to boil over. He straightened his stance, trying to regain the upper hand. "I don't need a lecture on the law from you," he snapped. "You think you can talk your way out of this because you're—" He stopped himself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Dana tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging. "Because I'm what? Officer? Educated? Successful? Black?" The last word landed like a thunderclap. A hush fell over the small crowd as Benson's face darkened. He opened his mouth to respond, but Dana didn't give him the chance. "You should know," she continued, her tone unwavering, "that I have no problem escalating this if necessary. This encounter is being documented." She gestured subtly toward the discreet dash cam mounted on her windshield. Benson's eyes flicked toward the camera, his bravado faltering for the first time. "You can't intimidate me," he muttered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I'm not trying to intimidate you," Dana replied, her tone soft but firm. "I'm trying to hold you accountable." For a moment, it seemed as though Benson might back off. His eyes darted between Dana, the camera, and the watching crowd, but his pride wouldn't let him. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "You're playing a dangerous game," he warned, his voice low enough that only Dana could hear. She didn't move, didn't blink. "And so are you." The weight of her words hung heavy between them. Benson's hand twitched at his side, his confidence visibly cracking. But Dana knew the storm wasn't over yet. She could see it brewing in his restless eyes. "Officer Benson," she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a bell. "Do you know who I am?" Benson sneered, masking his unease with defiance. "I don't care who you are." Dana took a small step closer, her calmness unnerving. "You should. I'm Dana Collins, the head of internal affairs for the state of Missouri." Her words hit like a thunderclap, their weight reverberating through the small crowd. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, and even Benson's face betrayed a flicker of panic before he masked it with a forced scowl. "You're lying," he said, though his voice faltered. Dana didn't flinch. "Feel free to verify it. Call your station. Pull up my credentials. I oversee the conduct of every officer in this state, including you." Benson's bravado cracked like thin ice under pressure. He took a step back, his mind racing but his body betraying his disbelief. His hand dropped from his holster as he shifted awkwardly, suddenly aware of the cameras, the crowd, and the damning nature of his behavior. The crowd murmured in agreement as Benson's earlier arrogance dissolved. Dana remained composed, her presence commanding. She gestured for the crowd to disperse, assuring them there was nothing more to see. As she slid back into her Tesla, she left Benson standing there, visibly shaken. The message was clear. Accountability isn't optional. True authority lies in justice, not intimidation.